Everyday injustice. Too many wrongful convictions. Corruption has infected the criminal justice system, leaving too many people helpless, fighting for their lives. Instead of receiving justice, people suffer. Is that why they say justice is blind?
Today on Everyday Injustice, we have back UC Davis law professor Jack Chin. How you doing, Jack?
I'm well. Thanks for having me.
All right. So it's been an interesting start to the year and an interesting start to the second Trump administration. What are your overall thoughts?
Well, I did not vote for this particular president. I am basically stunned in a state of shock. I am very concerned about the retaliation against government employees who, as far as I can tell, in many cases at least, were just doing what they were asked to do and engaging in conduct that appeared to be legal. And I think it is a very bad precedent to fire people who are doing their jobs in good faith. I think the removal of security details from people because of personal beefs when they are facing potential harm from enemies of the United States, again, based on the work that they did as government employees that they were asked to do, is very worrisome. It's very worrisome. The pardons of the January 6th insurrectionists, I think, is also a terrible precedent. And the efforts at unilateral action, not spending money as has been appropriated by Congress and mandated by Congress. President has an obligation to faithfully execute the laws. That's the oath. And that may mean, I would say, as a lawyer, a law professor, if the law is unconstitutional, if the president believes the law is unconstitutional, that creates a problem. But if it's just that the president disagrees with the money that the Congress has allocated, and a previous president, or maybe the same president, has signed into law, for them to say, well, I'm going to unilaterally unmake the laws by not spending the money that Congress appropriated, terrible, terrible problem. So we're going to see if our form of government has the ability to sustain these kinds of shocks. I will also say some of the cabinet nominees seem deeply problematic to me. I could go on. There's a lot more, and we're going to see what happens. I myself, as you know, am an employee of the University of California, Davis, and as such, I'm concerned about the well-being and operations of the Department of Education. And that's also a target, and we're going to see what happens.
On the upside, as a journalist myself, and for you as a law professor, there will be no shortage of material for the next 4 years to be working on.
Well, this is the alleged Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. And it's a curse because you'd rather not live in interesting times. You'd rather live in peaceful, pleasant, stable times. And it's true. There's going to be a lot to think about and a lot to write about in the next 2 years and 4 years. But I don't think that the excitement and entertainment is going to be worth the disruption to people's lives that takes place. But on the other hand, it may be a moment for some serious national introspection and consideration of what our real values are and what we really think is important and who we really think is in a position to carry those out. And we'll carry those values out. And we're going to see what people want. If people really were concerned about inflation and the price of eggs, I don't think that a lot of the moves that are being made now are going to respond to that. And maybe folks are going to have to think about cause and effect in a more serious way.
Yes, well, that's the flippant upside. The New York Times the other day ran an interesting article. Trump brazenly defies laws in escalating executive power grab. In the radical opening weeks of his second term, President Trump has appeared to feel very little constraint by any need to show respect for the law, for the rule of law. You know, it's really interesting, and as I watch all of this unfold, is there seems to be very little in the way of pushback other than, some states filing lawsuits against him. But I mean, can he really get away with some of this stuff?
It's all going to be tested in the courts. There are a lot of institutional players, nonprofits, the ACLU, the NAACP, Legal Defense and Education Fund, labor unions that are going to push back. There's no question that he wanted to open with a gambit of shock and awe, and shock and awe it was. He said, I mean, taking over Gaza and turning it into a resort, nobody's suggested that before. That is a novel proposition, a remarkable, innovative policy solution to a problem in the Middle East. He is unconstrained. Is any of this stuff practical or realistic? That's a different question. But there's going to be pushback, just as there was, for example, with the Gaza move. And there's lots of lawsuits. There's going to be more lawsuits. I got an email today from some immigration law professors that was a list. There are people who are making lists of all the lawsuits, and they're long lists, and they're going to get longer. So on the one hand, this isn't going to end without a judicial determination. A lot of these things are going to end up in the U.S. Supreme Court. Many of them, dozens of them, hundreds of them are going to wind up in the federal appellate courts. So there's going to be an evaluation of whether this stuff is lawful or unlawful. And some of it is clearly lawful. The president's allowed to do things with regard to immigration enforcement, for example, that I think is harsh and unwise, but he was elected president. It's his call. A lot of that stuff is going to be upheld. Some of it's going to be struck down, though. A lot of the employees that he would like to arbitrarily terminate have collective bargaining agreements or statutory protection or protection from being fired for political reasons under the Constitution.
Yeah, but to take that example, and then I really want to get into immigration, but to take that example, I mean, as I understand it, their recourse is going to be to sue, in which case, yeah, the government's going to have to pay money, but at the end of the day, they're probably still going to be out of a job.
We'll see. We'll see what happens. That's certainly a possible outcome. But again, going back to this question of congressional appropriation, the president can make people's lives difficult, but the president can't arbitrarily refuse to spend money that's been appropriated by Congress. I don't think. I think this came up in the Nixon administration, and that was the result. So,
yeah, I mean, I was going to bring that up, is that the Nixon administration tried to do this back in the 70s. Now, the problem was for Nixon was that he had a court stacked up against him, and he also had a Congress that had some muscle behind it and the ability to stand up against him. I'm not sure that Trump does.
We'll see. We'll see. I think you're absolutely right that the circumstances are different now than they were then. We are still living with you know, this is the aftermath of 1968, and and it's not over yet, and we don't know what the outcome is going to be.
Um, so on to immigration, and there are so many different aspects to this, but I want to start with the birthright citizenship thing because he kept warning he was going to do this, but I don't think any of us thought he was going to try to do it by an executive order, and it seems almost ludicrous, right?
Right, right. The This is an issue that's been kicking around for 40 years, and and maybe longer, uh, because it was litigated in the 1890s. But but uh, the theory has always been that Congress is going to have to do something if they want to change it, and so to do it by executive order is very problematic. My personal theory is that trying to accomplish a change in citizenship law by executive order, when it's so clear that it's within the responsibility of Congress, that this is a political gesture that's designed to give Chief Justice Roberts the opportunity to write a balanced decision, striking this down, when 8 out of 10 of the other things that he has done in the immigration context are going to be upheld, or 9. And so this is a way to do something that some people are going to like, and a gesture to give the Supreme Court the opportunity to do something that improves its diminished reputation.
Interesting theory. Um, and I kind of felt like this was his gesture just to the people that want him to do something about this, to say, well, I tried, and they overturned it.
Right. And so the question is going to be, does Congress go along? And in the past, they have not. They have not. Just as there's another important immigration issue, which is, I think, undoubtedly going to come up this term, and that is the right of undocumented children to a free public education, which was upheld in Plyler versus Doe in 1981, 5-4. And if it's 5-4 in 1981, then it's going to be, 3-6 the other way or something now, maybe. You worry. But Plyler versus Doe uh, uh, was also something that probably could have been overturned by Congress. Almost certainly could have been overturned by Congress. Congress considered a bunch of times various proposals to prohibit states from educating undocumented children, or at least to allow states to do that, and they didn't pull the trigger. Under Reagan, they didn't pull the trigger
I think
because
that's a tricky one for them, though,
it's harsh.
because the problem that you end up having is that, let's say you reason your way through and say, well, they shouldn't be here, therefore we shouldn't educate them. But do we really want all these uneducated people living in this country unless you can get rid of them somehow?
Right, right. Uh, uh, and, but the bottom line is that Congress neither proposed to get rid of them all, nor denied them an education. And I think they might well come to the conclusion that denying birthright citizenship is also not a high priority. It makes you look harsh. even Trump is talking about a DACA fix, or he has. So I don't think that the executive order, for our purposes, is going to be saved by a congressional statute, because if Congress basically adopted the executive order, now there's a stronger argument that it's valid. I still don't think it's valid, but there's a stronger argument that it's valid, and the Supreme Court doesn't have the easy out, which they have now, of saying this is up to Congress. Whatever the substantive law is, it's Congress that has the power to decide who's a citizen or not the president. It's just like appropriating money. The president carries it out, but the president can't change what Congress has done in that regard. And that's why what the Department of Justice is arguing in these cases is that the law already is that the children of undocumented migrants are not citizens. That's what the 14th Amendment means, and that's what the citizenship provisions of the Immigration and Nationality Act mean. They're already not citizens. The problem with that argument is that there's 5 or 6 US Supreme Court decisions that go the other way. Some of them are dicta, some of them are asides. There's language that you can wrestle out of other cases, to take the other way, but 5 or 6 times the Supreme Court has said the children of undocumented non-citizens in the United States are themselves subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, and therefore they're citizens. And so it's a tough argument for the Department of Justice to make.
Yeah, and I think that's one that I think they aren't going to get. But I think, the concern that maybe people like you and me have is how far he can get just using executive orders, and what happens. Like, yeah, I mean, does this take the ground out of checks and balances? Does the court leave the door open for further erosion down the road? This is, to me, the precarious position we're in right now.
Well, I think that's right. And I will tell you, what worries me about it is that the sort of unrestrained behavior of the president that hasn't been challenged by Republicans in Congress, they would never tolerate this from a Democrat, right? Nobody wants a world, I don't think, where every time there's a change of administration, the president declares an emergency and fires all of the government employees they don't like, and impounds all the spending that they don't want, and completely reorganizes the government by executive order. Nobody wants that. And so what is gnawing at me in the back of my mind is, do Republicans think that there's never going to be another change in government? President Trump, he doesn't keep secrets very well, and the discussion in the last campaign about this might be the last time you have to vote. Well, that could be hyperbole, but a lot of the things that he says along those lines are not. And so Republicans would never want this sort of roughshod, arbitrary executive action to be used on things that they care for. Somehow they're not worried about that, and that worries me.
Yeah, and I can see it from that standpoint. I can also see it from another standpoint that might be a little bit more benign, which is just they lack the will to stand up to him at this point.
Yeah, that's another possible spin on it. But either way, not great.
Well, and also it's a perfect storm, right? Because you have this situation where, I mean, Trump's never going to face voters again unless he can somehow change things, which seems still very unlikely that that would happen. Also, he's not that young. But you have this situation where the Republicans control both branches of Congress, and they control the upper court. And so that gives them a lot more leeway than pretty much any other scenario. One of the things that bugs me is that this was a very predictable outcome, and Biden had 2 years to kind of bulletproof things in the first half of his term, and he failed to do so.
Well, I think we can look at the Democrats and say they're catastrophic disappointments from Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her astonishing vanity to Joseph Biden and his astonishing vanity, and say, in retrospect, tremendous failures on Obama's part too. There's a sort of short-termism and short-sightedness on the part of perhaps all politicians, most politicians, many politicians. They don't think about the long term, and they don't think about the structure. I'm thinking, for example, of the Comstock Act, which prohibits the mailing of abortion-related materials. And Democrats naively thought, well, that could never be used to frustrate, Roe versus Wade will never be overturned, and even if it were, the Comstock Act could never be used, and I don't want to vote or propose a bill to repeal, something that some people are going to find immoral. Why would I use my political capital on that? And now it might be a dispositive thing in terms of reproductive rights. It may be that abortion pills and abortion information can't go in the mail, or Comstock Act now applies, as I understand it, to other common carriers and who travel in interstate commerce. And so something that could have been done before can't be done now. And there's a lot of that. Maybe we can say that it won't happen again, and maybe we should. It'll be interesting to see what the Republicans do to try and cement their current advantage into a permanent Republican majority. But we'll see. And then the flip side, you see other jurisdictions like the various states that have put reproductive rights into their constitution. They get it. They see that nobody now in Rhode Island is proposing to ban abortion. Why would we bother putting that in our constitution? Well, because it could happen, and anything could happen. And if we want rights protected, if we want governmental structures in place, then we're going to have to think about how to do that from in the face of people who strongly disagree with that position.
Yeah, personally, I actually go back to Lyndon Johnson because it was Lyndon's folly that started all of this slide when he decided to take a reliable liberal vote out of the Supreme Court in Arthur Goldberg and put in Abe Fortas, it set off this very interesting chain of events that you can track all the way through. And one of the really interesting things is that, if you go back in time, it's pretty balanced in terms of Democratic administrations versus Republican administrations over the last 50 years. What's not balanced is how the Republicans have managed to get so many more Supreme Court appointees. And it all started with the failure of Abe Fortas as Chief Justice when Earl Warren tried to retire in 1968.
Well, I think you're absolutely right about that. And it's interesting that Abe Fortas had to resign because of a scandal that is comparable and perhaps much less serious than that being experienced by certain Supreme Court justices now. But there was a time when politicians could be embarrassed. I think that time has passed. One of the public officials could be embarrassed, and the Goldberg thing was a catastrophe, and a catastrophe. I blame Johnson too for a lot of things. I think Bill Moyers said that Johnson was something like, Johnson was 15 of the most interesting men he'd ever met. And, Johnson has a large number of great qualities and a large number of terrible qualities. And one, second only to Vietnam, which he knew was a mistake, was the Goldberg thing. And if Goldberg and Fortas had stayed on the court, then we live in a different world. But one can also, in addition to Johnson's misjudgment, we can also blame Goldberg's misjudgment, because the idea, Goldberg was told that if he went to the UN and solved the Vietnam problem, that he could become the first Jewish president. Well, he did not accomplish step one of that, and he certainly didn't accomplish step two. So yes, this is one of the great what might have beens of U.S. history. Yeah,
and I'll just say in Goldberg's defense, like, you just couldn't say no to Johnson at times. And Johnson just knew how to get people to do what he wanted. Not everybody, but, a lot of people.
Yeah, well, that's the thing about life tenure. And Johnson hadn't fully revealed himself. The flip side is Goldberg thought that, that the further appointments would be by Johnson.
Right. Well, I mean, there's a lot of things. The other really interesting thing, I think, is that doesn't get enough play is the advent of the Federalist Society, because for a long time it was very hard for conservatives to kind of vet these justices, and so you had these kind of amazing mistakes where Eisenhower names Warren and Brennan, and even as late as Bush naming David Souter, who turned out to be moderate to maybe even liberal, depending on how you which areas you view things. But since the Federalist Society has come up, the right has pretty much hit 100% of their people.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how much is the Federalist Society and how much it is a sort of model. Every one of these people is if I'm recalling correctly, is a former federal appellate judge. And so, you know, they do the tryout on the road, and you know, we don't have any politicians, elected officials like Justice O'Connor or Justice Black. You know, it's you know, people who do a certain kind of thing in a certain context, and you know, there's no surprises because they've written articles, and so I think that the Federalist Society definitely played a role. It played a role in generating intellectual resistance. I've done a number of Federalist Society events over the years. I have found them, you know, I think at one level it's great. They're relatively open-minded in terms of at least in the events that I've been to, of who's in the room and the kinds of arguments they're willing to consider, but who they support for judicial appointments is very specific.
Yes. So, where are you seeing things going now with immigration? Because that seems to be the area that he can probably do the most damage, at least in terms of these substantive areas.
He wants more state participation in immigration enforcement. And so that may mean that there's going to be more state laws that are allowed. Certainly, it means that there's going to be enthusiasm for either 287G agreements, where state and local law enforcement officials actually become immigration officers, ICE officers, or CBP officers. They go through the training and they get federal credentials and they get federal immunity, and you know, and they can do all that stuff. There's also ways for federal state law enforcement officers to participate without a full 287G agreement. So I think there's going to be a ramp up in there has been a ramp up in enforcement. So the context is that the prior Democratic administrations have also done a lot of immigration enforcement. The political positioning has been that they want to show themselves that they take it seriously, so they can get some sort of comprehensive immigration reform, or so that they can protect certain groups like DACA. But politically, they thought, well, if we show that we have maintained control of the border, we're doing certain things, certain kinds of criminal prosecutions, certain kinds of enforcement, then we'll have the credibility to have the leeway to do other things that we also care about. And that really hasn't worked in terms of getting people to say, you know, skeptics anyway, to say, oh, the Democratic approach to immigration is a good one. So there's, you know, so it's not a question of enforcement or no enforcement. It's a question of the Democratic priorities have been things like, well, we won't go to schools or churches or hospitals, except in an extreme scenario. And that position has gone by the wayside. Another question has been, well, the Democratic view, the urban view, the view of many police departments that say, our job is to maintain order and protect the community. We're not here to do immigration enforcement. Our job is to, you know, again, protect public safety in general. They say, we don't want to do freestanding immigration investigations. We want to say that if you come to us because you witnessed a robbery, or if you come to us because you're the victim of domestic violence, You can talk to us and we won't ask you about your immigration status unless you're convicted of a serious crime or charged with a serious crime and you're going through the system. Then we might want you to get deported. But if you're reporting that your car was stolen, we're not going to, you don't have to worry about seeing the police or cooperating with the police, because in routine circumstances like that, we're not going to ask you about your immigration status. And that, I think, is going by the wayside in the current administration. And the theory is, if we do hyper enforcement, if we do significant enforcement in every circumstance, it will encourage self-deportation. Even the Trump administration isn't saying, you know, we have the capacity to round up 10 million people and put them in deportation proceedings or put them on buses and get them out of here.
Yeah, that's where I was kind of going to go with this question, is that, you know, they were kind of talking about mass deportation, but it doesn't seem like they're getting there.
Well, I think what they want to do is encourage self-deportation and do sort of high visibility, high shock and awe efforts that will deter future undocumented immigration and will encourage people to leave on their own. For example, you know, they're talking about using state detention facilities and things like that in Guantanamo. And so they could say, if they could go to a workplace and say, listen, we're going to come back tomorrow and we're going to arrest people who aren't here lawfully and send them to Guantanamo. Or you could just leave. In fact, we have a bus, a free bus. You don't have to get on it, but we have a free bus to Mexico, a free bus to Canada, and you can get on it and go. Or you can go to Guantanamo tomorrow. Or you can prove that you're a U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident, and you'll be just fine. But we'll be back tomorrow. And so I think they can do things, you know, by opening Guantanamo for alfalfa pickers. They can put people to a tough choice, and I think that's the enforcement strategy. That you can, they can't. Guantanamo isn't big enough for 10 million people, and they can't. There's only so many people they can arrest, even if they deport. Even they use expedited removal procedures, which are available in some cases. For example, for people who've already been deported, or for people who entered without inspection and don't have any legal status, or never did. But I think what they really want to do is encourage people to leave on their own, encourage people to leave voluntarily, and the way you do that is you make it as unpleasant as possible, the prospect of staying here and what might happen if you do stay here.
Yeah, I mean, Guantanamo is definitely a not pleasant option. But, you know, I think part of the dynamics here is, you know, we're kind of treating this as a one size fit all. And it really is, because there are people that are in this country that have been in this country for years and years and decades, and where they go. You know, I mean, I know people that have been here since they were children. They're not residents, and they've committed a crime. And so if they get released, they're going to get deported. And they're like, where am I going? I have no family. I have no connection to the country. I barely even speak the language anymore. And so you're kind of setting people up to be kind of quasi-homeless and
Sure. It's a
stateless almost.
tremendously cruel strategy. And there was a fellow named Emmanuel Seller, who was a representative in Congress from New York from the 20s to the 70s. And he was a great humanitarian man, and he lived through, the worst xenophobia and anti-Jewish legislation in Congress. And but he proposed, didn't get this through, that if you come to the United States before a certain age or stay here for a certain amount of time, you shouldn't be deportable for any reason. Imprisonable, yes, of course. But bad things can happen to you. But if you come here before you're, let's say, 10 years old, and you stay here for 10 years, where is somebody who's lived their whole life in the United States supposed to go? It's cruel. It's cruel. But the other piece of it, which I'm sure but there is no immigrant crime crisis. Immigrants, documented and undocumented, commit less crime than native-born Americans. Immigrants come here to work. They have a special incentive to keep their heads down, because if you're a legal immigrant, then you don't want to lose that status. And if you're an undocumented immigrant, then you certainly don't want to come to the attention of the authorities. Under Democratic and Republican administrations, immigrants who commit serious crimes, at least for the last 30 years, have been aggressively deported. And so the immigrant community contributes a great deal economically to the country without contributing crime. So why do we need to get rid of them? I don't see a reason at all. I think it's a mistake. Should we secure the border? Should we have an orderly method? Yeah, that would be ideal. Let's do that. Let's figure out how to do that. But it's a separate question from the people who are here in the United States already, and what should happen to them. And I'm not by any stretch of the imagination in favor of saying that we should get rid of them. And I haven't heard anybody make a case that they're a negative contribution to society.
Well, we could keep going on this, but we are out of time. So I want to thank you, Jack, for coming on again and having this very interesting and important discussion.
Thank you so much, David. Appreciate it.
We've been talking with Professor Jack Chin from the UC Davis School of Law. This has been Everyday Injustice. Join us again next week for more tales from the injustice system.
Thank you to George Powell and Norman Mouse Quake Barrett for the use of our opening, Everyday Injustice. You can see more of George's music at www.justiceforgeorgepowell.com. That's Justice for George Powell, all one word, .com.